Hey, well, what is up, everyone? Welcome to episode number 41 of the Faith and Pop Culture Podcast. It is me, your host, Daniel, and I am joined, as I always am, by the Monday after Easter to my discounted Easter Bunny chocolate, Mr. Samuel David Kemp. What is up?
Hey, not too much, Daniel. Always happy to go in for the Ferrero Rocher
Oh,
discount
man.
chocolate eggs. That's a game changer on the Monday after Easter for sure.
Yeah, if you're not hitting up your local Walmart or Target for discount Easter candy, then, you haven't quite figured out yet, how to live.
Yeah,
Uh,
the week after Easter is the best day to shop for next year's Easter.
And by next year's Easter, you mean that week to
Yeah,
gorge
yeah.
yourself. So we are glad to be back. So we probably should address the elephant in the room, and that is that we are back. Our last time we were on this episode or this podcast, we talked about how we may take 3, 4 weeks off, kind of after Christmas to reset and recharge for the new year.
And
And here
boy,
we
did
are.
we take 3 to 4 weeks off.
And we got into that break and say, hey, breaks are nice. So it has been a minute since we've been doing this podcast. I know
Yeah.
we've had a bunch of people reaching out saying, "Are you guys actually coming back? Are you done?" So it's good to be back. There's still lots of stuff to talk about in culture and to get into. As you
Yeah,
can notice here,
luckily Daniel and I didn't have creative differences and we're not gonna be starting our own podcast competing for
I mean, or did we?
airwaves.
Because as you might
Yeah,
notice, we are not in the same room. I think
that's
maybe
true.
over our over the break, we found out that we actually operate better at a distance. So if you're watching the video version of this podcast, you will notice it is different. We're not in the studio together. We're filming these from our home offices. And for the most part, if you've been following the podcast for a while, not a whole lot's going to change. We're still going to be getting into what's going on in pop culture, some big stories, some questions, and talking about movies and just everything going on. But we did kind of, as we took our break, just wanted to kind of restructure things a little bit. And really, our main goal is just to kind of strip it down a bit, like go a little bit more unplugged, a little more raw, a little more just kind of getting down to just like the conversation. Like, hey, me and Sam love talking about pop culture. Why don't we do away with some of the more rigid structure and stuff that we were doing with this, and really just allow us to let conversations go wherever we want them to go. Get into pop culture stuff. Have a lot of guests on. We already have. I know we kept we kept promising that with
We
the
promise we will have guests on
yeah.
eventually.
I
Trust
have
us.
several
The-
in my inbox right now. I just need to give them the green light. So we'll have some interesting people coming on just to have conversations about stuff, kind of wherever uh, you know we feel like there's interesting conversations to be had. So it will be a little bit different than what you guys are used to, and again, we'll tweak this thing as we go and kind of get back into it, shake off the rust, see what works. But for the most part, it's going to be the same show that you know and love. And hey, if this is your first time listening to us, then you won't know any difference.
Yeah. So thanks for checking us out. And yeah, we're gonna dust out those cobwebs. And if you're a rock and roll fan, this is the acoustic version, maybe of what we used to do. So, and I'm excited about that as a lifelong acoustic guitar player.
Yeah, this is
I don't know
our
how far we'll stretch this metaphor, but
Yes,
I'll
this
keep
is our
stretching it.
singer-songwriter era of the podcast. But if you have
Yeah.
been following like the collision, what we're doing, we took some time off of the podcast, but we didn't take time off of all the other stuff we do with the collision. I've still been reviewing movies. We've still been having interviews and articles and stuff. Again, if you guys haven't ever checked it out, go to thecollision.org. You can find all of our stuff while you're eagerly waiting for the next podcast episode. But one of the things I did want to mention, and we'll link it in the description, is I got to do a pretty fun interview just a couple of days ago with Mr. Stan Jantz, who is like a global ambassador for the Come and See Foundation, which if you're not familiar with it, if you're a fan of The Chosen, you've seen Come and See Foundation show up on your screen because they're sort of how would you describe them, Sam? They're like the nonprofit wing of The Chosen.
Yeah.
Um,
So yeah, they've been at least how he described it is they sort of have been tasked with in some ways distributing and partnering with churches and religious organizations to get the chosen show into as many different languages as possible. And I think their goal is something like 600 languages worldwide. And so it's sort of that arm that is trying to get that out there. And I think they're also, if I understood them correctly, they're also raising money to make sure that um, production and stuff happens as well, so that they can keep the actual show free to the consumer or to the audiences who will be watching it. So it's kind of a unique. I mean, I think everything about The Chosen is a bit unique, and I think that sort of partnership is kind of interesting as well. And it kind of harkens back a little bit to the Jesus film and how kind of a global thing that was to try and get this film into as many different languages. I think in similar ways, and you and Stan talked about this on the interview, so I don't have to rehash it here, but in many ways, there is that sort of, I think Come and See is sort of the missional arm of what Chosen the entertainment is doing, at least is kind of my understanding of it.
Yeah, and it was an interesting conversation too, because like The Chosen's massive. Like this
Yeah.
thing, and again, in the time that we were off the podcast, it like season 5 released in theaters, setting records. Like they had like all three of them were in the top like 5 or 10 releases in one week. Like it's this massive thing, but it's, like you said, Sam, it's so different than like any other, like there's no equivalent really to
Right.
what it's doing, how it's releasing, how it's funded. Like it's crowd funded, even though it's like one of the most popular shows in like the world. So it is
Yeah.
well, one thing that well, it's worth what is it, like a 13-minute
Yeah.
interview or
13,
so.
14 minute interview, but
But
worth checking out.
yeah, and not just because hey, I did it, but because Stan also has a lot of good stuff to say. So could you check it out the link and just sort of see some of the behind the scenes of the big show. And one other thing that recently happened that I wanted to at least mention, because it is one of the biggest like kind of topical kind of conversations, is that there is an Easter movie, if you will, released last weekend that's unlike other Easter movies. So Sinners, which is it's like a vampire horror period piece type movie from director Ryan Coogler, who most of you probably know from doing the Black Panther movies and also Creed, and really is one of like the big names out there in Hollywood right now. He's a pretty
Yeah.
young guy too. Like, I think he's like in his 30s. Like he's a young guy making all these movies. And like as someone that reviews like does like Christian movie reviews and stuff, like anytime there's a movie coming out called Sinners, it's like okay, there's gonna be stuff to get into. People are gonna have this one isn't gonna fly under the radar. And especially releasing on like Easter weekend, like Holy Week is like this is
My
gonna
my guess is there were some religious motifs involved.
yeah.
I personally, so I'll say that I didn't see it, and just for our listeners and viewers, most of the movies that we'll talk about over the course of this podcast, I will likely have not seen, just because I don't get to the movie theater all that often, and I don't have to write reviews for them, unlike you, and so, but it is always fun to dive into some of these. So yeah, I guess maybe what's your 20,000 foot view of this movie? And I should say too that you have a whole review, kind of a deep dive into this movie that folks can go watch on our YouTube channel, and I would encourage them to do so. But as someone who hasn't seen it, what do I need to know? And yeah, where do we go from there?
Yeah, because it is. I mean, as someone that like reviews movies, like the worst thing for me is a boring movie. Like, I would way rather watch and review and like engage in dialogue with like an interesting movie, even if I totally disagree with the whole worldview behind it,
Hmm.
than like a boring movie where I agree with everything and it's all very affirming my religious or whatever beliefs, but it just has nothing to chew on. Like, so
Right.
so I enjoy these. I know, but I know it is. I mean, even like the review I did, like I've got very stark, like polarized reaction. Some people that are, hey, is this don't agree with it necessarily, but it's just so well made and it's interesting and it's dealing with themes. And then like other people that are like, this is anti-Christian blasphemy. This is just a direct attack on religion. I won't get into like the whole plot. You can check out we'll link the review in the description too. But like definitely like the overarching themes, like it is like a people versus vampire type movie. but like kind of beneath the surface is very much like a kind of spirituality versus religion. Like it's this sort of the conflict between kind of like organized religion. Like the movie opens up with a shot of like a quaint like white walled church, and like the congregation singing this little light of mine, and like it's like it very much opens on that. And then like but like as that scene is happening, it starts like flashing these like images of like horror and stuff, and like the movie sort of cuts back to the day before and it shows what leads up to it, but it like kind of sets the tone for like you have this sort of organized sweet little church, but like there's also these like horror connotations to it, and like much of the rest of the film, like the vampires almost represent like kind of organized religion, and like there's a very like strong racial tones on it too. Like it's like a
Hmm.
black church, but it's the religion is very much like the vampires are all white, and like they sort of represent like not just like organized religion, but like sort of the colonizing aspect of this religion and how
So
it's imposed.
is it sort of like the seedy underbelly of like your Sunday best sort of idea that like everybody at church is there's sort of this facade of religiosity and niceness, but like underneath all of this, there's just total
Well, it's even
chaos.
like the because like the church people themselves aren't shown, like they're not the vampire, like, it's
Yeah.
they're not necessarily shown to be bad, but it's sort of implied like the main character is like a blues musician, and it's sort of like the blues music kind of represents like that's like music that came from the black community, didn't come from the outside. Like it's sort of, and they
Hmm.
connect it with a lot of like almost like pagan spirituality, and like whereas like church and church music and like the church life, like his dad, the pastor wants his son to get rid of his guitar and just sort of go like, so it's almost like
Right.
the film paints the church as this like oppressive force, and whereas like the blues and the
Interesting.
pagan spirituality, and like you have there's moments where like like garlic and like pagan rituals are effective against the vampires, but like at one point the character starts like reciting Psalm 23, and like the vampires join in, and like they're not bothered by the Bible, and like this brings us
Hmm.
comfort, and like very powerless. And so it's just interesting. Like I think again, I don't need to get onto the whole plot, but in many ways it's sort of the type of film that I think a lot of Christians just don't know what to do with. Like
Right.
at least at a deeper level, like it's the kind of movie that I don't think every Christian needs to go see, but it gets definitely resonating. Like a couple, I just pulled, like the success that this movie has had. Um, like I saw, like it's the first horror movie in 35 years to get an A cinema score, which is those are the ones that like they pull people coming out of the theater, and they sort of they have to rate everything, and then they give like a final score. And it gets rare that movies even get A, but like it's the
Right.
first horror movie in 35 years that did get an A. Rotten Tomatoes is 98% positive by critics, 97 by audience.
Oh,
That's the highest grossing original film, like not attached to some sort of property or IP, since 2019, which I thought was interesting. The top three on that list, there's Nope, which is a Jordan Peele movie, horror movie. It passed
yeah.
that by a million. And then Us, which is another Jordan Peele horror movie, has 71. So it didn't pass. That's the next like highest or whatever. Which I don't know. I don't know if there's anything to that, but it's like the three most successful sort of original films are all horror films by black filmmakers. This is sort of this niche audience that is sort of
Yeah.
like unexpectedly crushing it. But I mean, it's just so the film's like it's even when I went to it, like I went to it in IMAX theater at like a weird time of day when usually the theaters are empty, and like the thing was packed. Like the biggest theater in my AMC wasn't a seat empty. Like the movie's just doing real well.
Hmm.
So like, so I guess like for me, it's like, what do you do with that? Like it, I took it to be very much like a stark negative commentary towards religion. It's very much elevating sort of the pagan roots and associate like, it almost like puts the church on like the same level as like the KKK, and like it's sort of this evil, oppressive evil that we need to push back against and remain true. So it's I don't think it's at all like complimentary of Christianity. Um, but there's also a sense that but it is a movie that's interesting. I mean, it's extremely well made movie. Like this movie is going to probably be nominated for stuff. Like well acted, well filmed. Like so, it's like there's like an excellence level to it.
Hmm.
That I mean, beyond what I think of the message. I feel like you have to affirm like this is good cinema. Um, but I do think like not that every Christian needs to go see this movie, but there is a sense I just don't think it's overly helpful just to like get up in arms about these sort of things and like
Yeah.
oh this is gonna. I feel like it is something Christians can kind of dialogue with and try and get to like the root of like because I feel like in many ways like what it's although it's very like narrow and like the racial undertones and stuff and like the historical context is maybe more specific, but I feel like it does reflect just sort of that like the some of that tension that's we see everywhere like in other contexts of sort of like especially with a lot of like Gen Z and stuff like sort of
Yeah.
negative opinions and stigma of like the organized religion and stuff, and more of like an individualistic, kind of almost self-serving spirituality that it's like you have a connection to this power, but it also lets you kind of like there's no like moral demands. Like in the movie, the kid's like a pastor's son, but he's like having, he's like sleeping with a married woman, and it's like presented as like a good thing, and he's like liberty, and so it's like
Huh.
it's just sort of like I feel like it represents so many things that are enlightening to just sort of understand today's culture and like that tension between like sort of the more individualistic spirituality and like the more traditional established organized religion. Um, so I
Because
think
I
I
think
don't know.
that's very much, I think, a tension right now in our culture. And so I think it is, as maybe not your cup of tea that a movie like this, I would imagine there's a lot of Christians who just won't see this, um, just maybe out of a principle or something, and that's totally fine. But I do think movies like this, I think, can be very eye-opening, at least into like, okay, so how is our culture and the next generation being influenced, but also what are the things that they're wrestling with, but also like how are they representing themselves in cinema as well? And so, I mean, it sounds like it's at least a good movie to see to, I think, to bring understanding to yourself in a way that maybe you wouldn't get elsewhere or, by just reading articles and stuff. So I don't know. I mean, I think it sounds like it's a really interesting movie, and
Yeah, and like I
I
know
look
we
forward
always
to seeing it on streaming whenever that
yeah,
happens.
and like I know we with the collision like always talk about movies as like conversations. Either
Right,
the filmmaker having a conversation with his audience or with his culture or like whatever, or people having conversations about like that again, not every conversation is like edifying, and that Christians, well, to be relevant, you got to go watch, because there's a bunch of there's not nudity, but there's like a lot of sexual stuff and talk, and but like it's not a film that is for everyone, especially not
right,
for every Christian. But I do think that there is a sense that Christians like a conversation where two people totally agree with each other is not very interesting. Like I think
right,
Christians can dialogue with things and with movies, and it's like, hey, I'm hearing what you're saying. I'm like coming in with an open mind. Totally disagree with it, your point. Here's why, but I'm at least listening to sort of this perspective, and I kind of understand where you think you're coming from, and then we can go from there. I feel like that's a very biblical, that's sort of like Paul in Athens type thing of
right,
at least listening first beyond just like, oh well, if they're disagreeing with me, then they're wrong. I'm going to boycott, and it's the worst thing that happened to Holy Week, ever. And so I don't know. I just thought it was an interesting. I wanted to touch on it because you just more and more you are getting films from like mainstream culture that deal with spirituality, like not Christian, like faith-based stuff, but like spiritual stuff. And I just think it's interesting to sort of how, as a Christian, it's interesting to listen and see and look in on how they're wrestling with those themes. But it is interesting too because it's at Easter, which is, I'm guessing, no accident that this film released at Easter time. And Easter to me has always been an interesting one for cultural stuff because you kind of think of like Christmas as like we have a Christmas movie season. Like there's
mhm,
every year there's you get all your Christmas, Hallmark just waits all, or Hallmark fans, wait all year to get like their slate of all those like new, like whatever Hunky Frosty or Hot Frosty or whatever the one last year was. Like Christmas movies, you have all the different every year there's some new telling of Dickens. Like, but we don't necessarily get the same. We don't talk about the same with Easter, although like there is a lot of Easter movies. Like and they tend to be religious, obviously. Like, you don't get a ton of like Easter bunny movies every year, but like even this year, like tons of Christian movies about like I think all in theaters at the same time. There was the Last Supper, the Chris Tomlin one, which dealt with the gospel resurrection of Jesus. The King of Kings, like the Angel Studios animated film, which tells the crucifixion story of Jesus in animated form, and then like The Chosen, which is focused on the Last Supper this season, so you don't get to the resurrection or crucifixion yet, but it very much colors the entire thing. Like,
Right.
like it opens with Jesus talking about how he has to die, and like, so it's like pretty amazing to have like three simultaneously like in theaters films that are like telling the biblical story of the gospel. Like I don't know if that's
Yeah,
ever happened. To,
yeah, I know, and I think I think you were on the Religion Unplugged podcast recently
yeah,
talking about this phenomenon. Not necessarily Easter, but just this idea that like sort of faith-based film is really having its moment now. Like it's broken through whatever glass ceiling I think there was in Hollywood or perceived glass ceiling. I mean, because Hollywood's always cared, I think, or at least portrayed religious themes and church ideas and spirituality, just probably not in the way that most people in the church um, would want to see it portrayed. But I think it is really interesting that in this, like you said, I mean, there's like half a dozen movies to choose from, all of which I think most church-going people would be enthusiastic about watching. And like it's all in theaters, you know, most of them are doing quite well. Um, and some of them are sort of really cutting edge, I think. Like I think of like the King of Kings movie and just the talent alone that was brought in for the voice acting and stuff in that movie. Like it's sort of the who's who of Hollywood, all playing the voices of some of these characters in that animation. And so, yeah, I mean, I just think it's a really fascinating time uh, for for faith-based films and just for themes of spirituality and religion in Hollywood as a
yeah.
whole.
Like you could almost like you mentioned I was on the Religion Unplugged podcast, and like on that podcast, like I sort of rose the question like you could almost make a case that like there's too much like the sort of like
Yeah,
how many times can we not that you like get tired of or you should get tired of like the gospel story, but like how many different perspectives like at some point it does it get kind of watered down of like everyone now faith-based films are big now, so every studio and stuff needs their own Jesus thing every year. And it's like, well, like there's this, I mean there's a lot. But one of the things that I always gets me interested with, like, because obviously the Easter movies, like the Jesus dying on the cross empty tomb movies, are like the most clearly like resurrection stories. Like these are
mhm,
Easter stories, like that really. I mean, the tomb's still empty. Like they're not like they don't lose relevancy, but I
yeah,
mean, like, they're the kind of films that only really come out at Easter. Like if you're gonna make a resurrection story of Jesus, you just sort of pencil in that Easter release date. Like you don't necessarily release it in October.
right.
Like it's kind of like Christmas movies. You don't release them in like February. Like so like they're the most like easy to see. But kind of gets me. I always almost every kind of Easter season. What interests me is just to think about like resurrection in Hollywood and like less like overtly faith-based religion, like less like this is Jesus literally on the cross, and more like just that like motif of like that theme of resurrection, because it's everywhere. Like I just wrote, we'll link it below to I wrote an article titled Jesus and the Resurrection Myth in Hollywood, um, kind of based on that of just like, hey, the theme. Yeah, we got our Mel Gibson, the Passion of the Christ type movies, and like next year the sequel comes out fittingly titled The Passion of the Christ colon resurrection. It's like focused on more of that side of the story. Like, so we're always gonna have those, but like beyond that, like when you sort of step back to just like look at the big movies that there are, like it's almost hard in some ways to find movies that don't have that theme, like that don't. it's not always like a literal this character died and they get brought back to life. Although a lot of stories have characters that literally die and get brought back to life.
Yeah.
But it's and one of the interesting things too is like some of you guys might know like I'm a big Joseph Campbell guy. Like the hero's journey, the monomyth. Like if you're not familiar, like he's the guy that uh, I mean he's dead now, but like the famous kind of mythologist that studied this endless amounts of myths and all across culture, sort of the stories of these cultures, and I came up with the theory that like basically we only tell one story, like we tell like parts of it, but like you can kind of map out this hero's journey in like every story that every culture has been telling, which is just like a really interesting idea. Like, and like people have argued, and like especially American mindset is like, don't tell me, but our first thought is like, I can find you stories that don't fit. We want to kind of prove them wrong. But like, even if it's not like universal, that like every single story ever told is just that myth, like I think there is no argument that like we tell a lot of the same stories. Like there's a lot of
Yeah.
things, like repetitions in stories that you can like just sort of trade out the hero and they're going on the same kind of arc. Um, and like looking at some of his like as he there's a famous interview he did book called The Power of Myth, where he's sort of talking about this theory, and he says the quote it says the death and resurrection of a savior figure is a common motif in all of these legends. Somebody has had to die in order for life to emerge. So essentially what he's saying is like you look at all the stories told across different cultures across time, like the idea that some sort of unworthy, like some noble hero who's unworthy of death has to sort of sacrifice themselves and die in order for life to come and like set people free has been like a theme that you just continually find in stories. And like even Christopher Vogler, I think, is another kind of famous guy. He was like a executive at Disney and Fox and I think Warner Brothers, and kind of based a lot on Campbell stuff. But he kind of famously wrote like a little like pamphlet for Hollywood that basically laid out sort of this hero's journey, and like he distributed it, and it sort of became like the guidelines for so many movies. Like, I think the famous ones like Lion King, very much let's make a story that tells this thing. So you have
Yeah.
all those story beats. And he kind of says, according to the article, but he talks about the word sacrifice in Latin means like making holy is like the definition of it. But he says like heroes are often required to sanctify a story by making a sacrifice, perhaps by giving up or giving back something of themselves. And we don't need to get into it, but like, if you look at like the seven basic plots, another like real famous sort of story archetype book, like he lists like rebirth is one of the common like one of his seven plots that he like really any of the people that analyze like commonalities in stories, like the resurrection theme is always in there because it's just you find it in so many stories. And I mean, like, I don't know if any like what ones come to mind for you. Like just if you like think of the stories like in your own mind and
Yeah.
heroes, like it's endless. Like all the big
Right.
stories have it.
Well, and I think the thing, not so much that like every story necessarily has to have this, but that like the bulk of the stories that have lasting impact have this. So like the stories that have stood the test of time, most of them have these motifs. So like your Star Wars, your Lord of the Rings, um,
Harry
Harry
Potter,
Potter. Yeah. So
Avatar. Just watched those with my kids for the first time. Has
yeah.
literal death and resurrection. Um,
Yeah, and even Hunger Games, like there was a new Hunger Games book that came out recently, so I was reminded of that. Um, so yeah, I mean, I just think I think it's not that like you can't have this in a story that's good, but it's I think the ones that are memorable and like have a stickiness in our collective conscious are the ones that sort of follow this hero's journey pattern. Whether like, is it like did the hero's journey pattern come first, or have we just been telling that story? Like is that a biological thing, or have we just been doing that for so long that it feels that there's something that resonates with us intuitively with that motif, and
yeah, because
that's what
that is
makes
the
it.
question. Like because Joseph Campbell, like the hero, the guy that came up with it, he was like a super like kind of new age spiritual guy. Um, like so for him, it was very much you find these common themes because there's something deeply spiritual about these stories, like that represent our own. But he was very like individual that like he was sort of the sinner's uh mindset. Like he was Jesus was like for him, Jesus was just one of those stories. Like you have Harry Potter die,
Right.
you have Luke Skywalker rebirth, you have Jesus, you have this guy, you have Katniss. Like Jesus was just one of the stories that we tell, and it was very sort of like spiritual, which obviously as a Christian we I don't agree with, but like but there is sort of that question of like so like why does so many because even in a like there's like the more like explicit ones like this character died and then they get brought back but like even in a more general sense, like like a lot of sports movies, like I think like Space Jam or Remember the Titans or some of these movies, like it's not always like a literal they
Hmm.
died, but like there is sort of like a figurative sense that like they sort of have their, like with Remember the Titans, it's sort of like the racial tension. With Space Jam, it's like more this their confidence and their identity, and like in a sense, they sort of die before the championship game or like before the fourth quarter, and they kind of get reborn. The Looney Tunes rediscover that they're cartoons and can do all these stuff in the fourth quarter, and they come back to win. Or like remember the Titans, they sort of die to their like racial prejudices and kind of grow beyond that to go win the game. And like there is sort of a sense that like stories need that. Like that's the hero has to sort of lose something before they can I think even like in a sense in a wider sense I think like the Star Wars trilogy, like people always talk about the Empire Strikes Back, like the dark one where the heroes lose, like in a sense even that is kind of like a follows that pattern of like heroes don't just like win and then the movie's over. Like they
Right.
sort of reach a point where they can't and they have to like they're in despair and they got to be reborn somehow stronger and wiser and like taking in all these stuff that they've learned in order for like the final boss, the challenge. That it's that like it's just sort of it's hard to get away from like there's this thing about that template that makes for good stories like that resonates with
Yeah.
people. And like the question is like you said, Sam, like so why is that, like why because people have used that like to like it's not uncommon to find people to say, hey, hey, you Christians, like you think, your God is so, your story is so original, but like you're just like Hollywood these days. You're just recycling old stories, like because
Yeah.
you can find a lot of like of these myths that like predate the gospel that have like deities or heroes that sacrifice and die and get reborn to sort of as the savior figure. Like it's not like Jesus is the only type of story you can find of that. Like,
Right.
so people have used that to be like, your story, the gospel is not special. Like, because obviously these stories have been around for a long time. And I think what that kind of misses for me as a Christian that believes in the Bible is like I think the resurrection story doesn't start like at Easter, if that
Mm.
makes sense. Like that's like the fulfillment of it. Like
Yeah.
as but like the resurrection story, the death and starts at like the Garden of Eden. Like it starts at you know whatever couple I don't know how long it was they were in Eden. Like it starts at Adam and Eve, like the start of humanity. As soon as things were severed, those punks in the garden ate the apple. Like at that point, like that kicks into gear God's plan and like to bring Jesus and like so like there are definitely like stories that like had that theme like that predate the actual like gospel story, but like
Hmm.
they don't predate the historical like the story that God's doing. Like if you trace that back historically, like in some ways it would be sort of surprising, which I think actually C.S. Lewis said, like it would almost actually be surprising and like more of a challenge to Christianity if there weren't stories of like resurrection, like in other myths and stuff,
Yeah.
because like it's just so wired into us, like our entire human existence since the first man and woman has been in need of sort of this savior figure to come. That like like we've never told stories or come up with stories in a world where that wasn't a reality. That like it makes sense that even thousands of years later, we still can't stop, whether we acknowledge it or not. Like we
Yeah.
still can't like stop telling stories of the resurrection.
Yeah, and I mean I think all of that's very true. And I think too, even on like a not necessarily on like a story or a narrative level, but I think even on like a biological level, there is no life without death. Like, you know, everything has to eat to live, and to eat, things have to die, you know, not to be like totally morbid or anything, but it's like there is this, you know, burden of existence, right? Like there is a sacrifice that has to be made in order for you to live, even. Like, so even on like the very you know, existence level, sacrifice is required. And so I think that, I mean, maybe that it's just inevitable that that gets baked into stories. Um, but yeah, I mean, I just think that's, yeah, who knows how ingrained in our DNA that is, but y- yeah, it is just something that's very, I think it's very powerful and very much just a part of the human story and the human experience as well. And I think, I mean, I just think the best version, and I think the truest version of that is the Easter story. That is the fulfillment of this sort of long arc of death and resurrection throughout the history of Scripture and of the world.
Yeah, because there's interesting. We can kind of end with this, um, as he often does. C.S. Lewis. I mean, he offered a lot to the world, but like one of the things he offered a lot of is just a great quote.
Yeah,
There's a good C.S. Lewis quote for almost anything that you need to get. But he has a great quote. He wrote a essay I think called like "Myth Became Fact." I think is what the name of the essay, where he was essentially talking about this question about how, hey, there's, because he was like super into mythology. Like he taught English, like was his main profession before he became like an apologist, and like so he loved all like the Norse mythology and like the Greek, all the pagan stuff, and then like he became a Christian. Like in some ways, that actually kept him from becoming a Christian initially. Is like he just found those myths so much more compelling at first than like the
yeah,
Christian one. Like he didn't want to do away with them, so he just has like an interesting perspective on like when he became convinced of the truth of Jesus, sort of like he sort of wrestled with like what does this mean for all this other stories that I love and that is so meaningful to me. So he wrote like an essay kind of unpacking that, and he has a great quote, which I can quote in full because it's some solid stuff. But he says, "The heart of Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be a myth, comes down from heaven, the heaven of legend and imagination, to the earth of history. It happens at a particular date in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. But by becoming fact, it does not cease to be a myth. That is the miracle." Um, Essentially saying like the gospel story is sort of the fulfillment. Like it sort of is a myth in the same way that we've all these other myths and stories of resurrection, with the difference that like it actually happened. Like
yeah,
this is sort of the myth that is reflected in all these other fictional myths, and it gives power to the reason we resonate even with those stories is because of this myth, which is
mm,
in fact a fact. Which I've always loved that quote. It's the
yeah,
idea of like the true myth, uh, the fact that it is sort of this story, this myth that we tell, but it's true, and like, that makes all the difference in the world. But again, I think it is an interesting thing just to see. That's one of the things I try and do when I watch any kind of movies or review is just like obviously it's easy to see when something like the gospel movie that's reflecting Christianity. This is a faith-based movie, but I think what makes sort of that whole divide of like sacred, secular, faith-based and like secular as two very separate things is that in so many ways you can't separate them because like I feel like
yeah,
you get these glimmers of like everyone, even the non-Christian, is made in the image of God in a world where their soul long like needs salvation. Like so, like even a movie like Sinners, like you're still getting these echoes and reflections of things that at least touch on truth and like the need
It's
within
almost
humans.
as if it's almost as if like people just cannot they can't escape that reality that like the myth, the true myth of the resurrection is so strong that even if you like are the most ardent atheist or agnostic or total materialist or whatever, that like even you cannot, when you want to tell a compelling story, you can't get away from the most compelling story, which is that resurrection motif. And I think it just comes through. And I think in some ways, and maybe you've said this before, but like in some ways, that is sort of I think one of the things that points to um, just the truth and the power of Scripture is that like look at this movie that is in no way trying to be, religious or Christian, but yet the the imagery is so strongly tied back to the monomyth, or tied back to the story of Christ in some way, the resurrection motif, which I think is just a really cool sort of observation about our culture and people.
Yeah, and it's funny too, like because people talk about like the Christ figure, like
Right.
usually whenever there's a character that does do like the resurrect, this sort of death sacrifice, like that's the literary term is like the Christ figure, which is
Yeah.
just sort of interesting that even like, and some of that's just based on the history of how we sort of develop these theories and literary theory and all that kind of stuff. But I, like in some level though, I feel like it does sort of just show like intuitively we recognize that like there's something special about the Jesus version of that story, like that is sort of the ultimate of all these, like it's not the Harry Potter figure. Like it's, like the Christ figure is the one that all these other figures, characters like do point to in some
Yeah.
ways. But hey, maybe in the comment section, if you're watching this on YouTube or wherever you're listening to this, let us know some other like famous. Because again, it's hard not like once you start looking for it, like it's just in everything. Like because even like I've been thinking with the article is on my mind, and like then like every movie and thing I was watching is like, oh, resurrection, resurrect. You just start seeing it everywhere. So maybe share in the comments. Let us know like some of your favorites or kind of well-known resurrection stories or ones that sort of resonate with you. Best thing I know will resonate with you because it should resonate with all intelligent, wise, good Christian people. Is what we're going to talk about in sort of the end of this podcast with things we like that you should like too. So I thought this would I could kick it off this week, share something that I like because it is fresh on my mind. I'm reminded of it every time I check my bank account, and that is that I just got back a week ago from a trip to Disney. I don't know. Have you ever been to Disney, Sam? Uh,
I ran through the park
Oh yeah, we
on
did
our
the
on our
Disney
Disney
marathon.
marathon.
Kind of, you know,
Humble brag
yeah,
that
one of the
happened.
marathons when we were.
But
But
no, I haven't. We are planning to go later this year. Um, Take the kiddos. It's probably about time for them to see the magical kingdom. But no, I have not been. I've been to Universal, but not Disney.
Yeah, I mean it's the bomb, man. Like it. I mean,
Yeah.
I haven't been. I went as a kid, but once like I had to foot the bill, then we haven't gone with my kids. But really wanted to take them. My kids are 10. It's a good age for them to go. And like I know Disney isn't necessarily always like in the best graces for Christians these days, but man, it was fun. Like there's so much about the aesthetic immersive experience. We went to like first time I ever went to like the Star Wars land at Hollywood Studios, and like
Oh, cool.
had like non-alcoholic drinks in the cantina and like Star Wars restaurant, or we went to Harry Potter World and we're pounding some butter beers and like I don't know, it's I think beyond even just Disney, to me it just reminded me of like just the importance of like getting away. Like I
Yeah.
think one of the things that makes Disney so fun is like not just that it's the most magical place on earth, but like it is really set up in such a way that like, you get so lost in it, like you get so immersed, and like like I was probably the most unplugged I've been in a long time. Like I was, other than like checking things maybe real quick, emails while waiting in line or something. Like you just, you can't see cities. Like, you're all the wall. Like, you're just sort of in this world for however many days, and it's like I know I just came back feeling kind of refreshed. Like I was like worn out because when we went hard. Like me and
Well,
my
I'm
kid,
sure.
like we had conquered the park by like before lunch, and then we'd skip lunch to go conquer again. But like, like, so we went
Yeah.
pretty hard and like conquered it. Also, like I was worn out from that, but I think there is something to be said whether you go to Disney or you just like go to the mountains or you know some other you know way to get away, go on a hike or something. Like
Yeah.
just the importance of like getting away and like just a lot of like the noise and the stuff that like all the outrage, all the fighting on social media, like, and you just sort of realize like none of it matters. Like, like it seems such a big deal, all this stuff, but like then you get away and you're just like chilling in Harry Potter world for a couple of days, and like, yeah, you know what? Like maybe that's not as big of a deal as it seems like when I'm like doom scrolling on my computer for so long. So
Yeah.
I will recommend if you have a chance, if you're close and can swing it, do a day at Disney. But otherwise, just take advantage of those days to go unplug and just get away from real life for a bit.
Yeah.
But all that being said, speaking of unplugged, I've enjoyed coming back with this episode. The plan, I know our plan. I feel like we've lost the trust of the American people with our promises and unfulfilled promises. The plan is that we'll be back every week. Like I said, we have some interesting, got some cool guests I'm excited to get on and just pick their brain. Like, kind of our goal has been like find interesting Christian people in like all fields of kind of entertainment or the arts or church life or just people that we think are interesting and want to learn from. So have quite a few people that we've already lined up. We've just sort of been waiting for our epic comeback to get them on. So we'll start
Exactly.
having those people on, and then yeah, we'll be back every week, just looking at whether it's like a big thing movie came out we want to get into, or just like another question of hey, how should Christians do X, Y, or Z in culture? We'll get into that, and every week we'll be bringing our same charming, winsome personalities.
Don't
So
forget
until
handsome.
then, we will see you next time for more conversations on faith and pop culture.